Hi, I'm Kim Gladden, Director of Discipleship. I want to welcome you to today's discipleship conversation. Wow, what a time we are living in. Many of us just celebrated our first digital Easter. We've been hearing reports of some of the wonderful things that happened on this first online Easter, the fellowship, the experience, the salvations. We've also heard from some of you how much you miss the physically gathered community. And we've been hearing from all of our pastors and leaders about how difficult it is sometimes to pivot and learn this new technology. And yet, through it all, we continue to worship. So we've been worshiping online, in homes, in small groups, in drive-in parking lots, but worship is still happening. And today's discipleship conversation, we are talking about worship as discipleship. As we're worshiping, are there things that make for effective discipleship through our worship? And are there any guiding elements or principles? So I hope that you'll join us today in the chat room, be an active part of this conversation. I am so thankful for those who are joining in the conversation today. I have Josh Lavender here with us, and he is the worship pastor at Trinity Wesleyan in Fishers, Indiana. He's also the founder of the Wesleyan Worship Collective. So if you're saying, what is that? Just stay tuned. You're going to hear about that Wesleyan Worship Collective. We also have with us today Maribeth Jennings, and she's coming to us from the Western New York District Office. And she's also a student at the Robert Weber Institute of Worship. So her worship is her heart and passion. We're happy to have Maribeth here with us. And then we also have Brandon and Jen Peterson, and they are pastors of Resurrection Life in New York City. And so they are Wesleyan pastors who are right there near the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. They've been pastoring on the front lines, and so they're going to bring us a report. And we also have you, because we hope that you will come today to the chat room and just jump on in with your thoughts, your comments, and your questions. Again, today's conversation is worship as discipleship. And I want to jump right in. Let's begin with Josh. Josh, first of all, welcome. Thanks for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about, Josh, about where you're located and how you're a worship pastor, so you can identify with the pivot we just all made to online worship? What has Trinity Church done, and where are you? Just give us an update, Josh, first.
Yeah, so Trinity Church is in Indianapolis, Indiana. Love it here. We got the cornfields, and so we're doing great. But basically, we've just made the shift of going online like many churches, and we're pre-recording our services during the week, and this gives us time to kind of edit them and just make it a nice online experience. And right now we're just doing 2 at a time, and so it gives us time to kind of do all the music for 2 of them, do all the hosting and the pastoral stuff, and then putting them out 2 at a time.
Thanks, Josh. Well, I want to ask Maribeth that same question. Maribeth, you have a kind of a broader view because you're in the district office there in Western New York. How is worship happening?
Kim, it's happening in all different fashions. It's been exciting to see how quickly our pastors have just jumped into sometimes brand new technology and used it in order to be connected with their congregations in all different fashions. They've gone on YouTube, Facebook Live. They've learned how to use cameras, and they're purchasing new things that the district has helped with, purchasing those kind of things. And they have just been amazing. So it's great to see the new connections that they've made to people that maybe would never have connected with the church because it's a less threatening way for them to connect. So we've heard some amazing stories of what new connections have been made.
You know, Maribeth, as we sit here and we think about worship continuing to happen, many people are retooling. They're pivoting. They're now doing worship online. And so I thought this is the perfect time while we are redesigning and re-implementing worship services and worship platforms and venues to talk about this whole concept of discipleship through worship. And Josh, I want to start with you. When I mention that connection, when I say that worship can be discipleship or discipleship as worship, what connection do you draw? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it's easy to think of worship as maybe just music, or we talk about worship and think, yeah, it's just like the music that we play before we get to the sermon or something like that. But I know my thought, I guess, is worship just being super broad as our engagement with one another, our engagement with God. And we use music for a lot of that, but it makes me think of, I guess, the truth that God is so active in what we do as a community together to shape and reshape things inside of us.
Maribeth, would you weigh in on that when we think of this whole concept of saying that we can be discipling as we worship, that there are elements? What connections do you draw when we bring up this connection of worship and discipleship?
Yeah, I think that we often think of the worship time as teaching us something. Like most parents, when they go home from church, they say to their kids on the way home, "What did you learn today?" And I think that's how we think of church. And that's true. There's nothing wrong with that question. But I think what we need to focus on and remember is that the things that we do repeatedly form us, they do something to us. So instead of maybe thinking of what I'm learning, think of how is it changing me? And there may be ways that you don't even realize that our worship is doing something to us. And I think of it as sort of a spectrum between being catalytic or cumulative. So, are we looking for an experience when we come to church, or are we realizing that just our presence there is actually changing us and forming us? And this is true for gathered worship when we're all together. It's also true for our private worship.
Tell us what you mean by private worship, Maribeth. What are you referring to?
Well, there's this idea, and I think we're all experiencing it right now, the juxtaposition or the spectrum, like I'm saying, of scattered and gathered. We're scattered because we're all in our own places. The church is out. Like we have one of our churches that said, the church has left the building. They put a sign out in front. The church is out in the world right now. That's the way it is every week. We go to church together, we gather together, and then we scatter. And we're worshiping our God as individuals, and then we come back together. And those two concepts are important to have together. We can't just have one or the other. In fact, I was reading an author this week that was talking about how when we put all of our eggs in one basket and our only time that we worship is in that one spot on Sunday morning, then we end up having putting too much pressure on that particular event. And that's when people get upset and have things that they argue about. But if we're worshiping the Lord throughout the week and then we gather back together, those two things feed each other.
Maribeth, I think that is such a good connection that you've drawn, because usually when we say worship, everybody immediately is thinking about our church service. And you bring to us this reality that worship should be occurring all week long. Josh, I want you to hop in on this. Again, I said we've had to pivot, we've had to transition. And this is a wonderful time to begin to think about, as we're planning worship services, and I think you both have been associated with the Robert Weber Institute of Worship, and bring us some things from that. But what should we be thinking about? Because I know, for a number of churches, it's just, well, we just do this every Sunday. It's just like rote. It's just like a format that we just do all of the time. And so what should we be thinking about as we design a worship service?
Yeah, I think uniquely right now, we're just, maybe some things have been highlighted that are really helpful and useful in worship. And one of them that I think of is just giving people the opportunity to express what's going on or what they're feeling to the Lord and to each other. And so, I saw some people put on Facebook, and I thought it was great, just giving people space, even in the online service, for prayer, or space to grieve what's going on or what they're feeling, or space to tell the Lord, or, turn to each other. So I know we don't have it figured out, but we're trying to think of things like that. How do we allow for engagement and allow for people to have just these moments of a space to say how they're feeling to the Lord. And I think that's been a helpful, I guess, prayer, even for me, is like it just starts with saying, God, this is what's going on, and I'm just going to be radically honest with you. So that's one thing I've been thinking about lately as we're designing services, is how do we create those moments of space for people to be real?
Oh, wow, Josh, I think you've hit on something there because um, particularly in this time where people have some elements of grief, some elements of lament, some elements of questions and fears, and how do we design a service that as we glorify God, we do make some room for some acknowledgement of what might be going on in the lives and minds. I hear you saying that as we're designing a worship service, being aware of the season that we're in. Maribeth, what do you add to that as you think about elements when we're thinking about our worship service?
I agree. I think one of the things that we often leave out, even in times when we're not having a pandemic, is allowing for lament. If you read the Psalms, you read Lamentations and other books of the Bible, it's full of those, and it resonates with people. I think sometimes we can possibly come across as out of touch if we don't just recognize where people are when they're worshiping. But I will say at the same time, we can also focus on the truths of the Lord's. I would say it's helpful to have like the church calendar is what I'm trying to say. For example, right now we're in the season of Easter. You know, I had a whole bunch of people say, "How was your Easter?" Well, I'm trying to come back to them and say, we're in the season of Easter. And those things are grounding to Christians. So we can also have that truth of the gospel and the hope of the gospel. So it's not just lament. You can't just skip lament. You have to have that. But then you also end with praise and the truth of the gospel.
What part would you say that theology plays as we're planning worship experience?
Are you asking me?
I'll ask you, and then we'll go on to Josh. I'm just thinking, when we think of, I need a fast song, I need a slow song, I need I need an engaging sermon, and I'm just wondering what part does theology play, or does it have a role as we are planning worship service? What is our theology of worship sometimes? Because now, particularly as we get ready to transition. I heard someone say that we're bringing whatever theology of worship we had on the inside of the building. We're just transferring that to the internet. And
that's very true.
If we don't reflect,
That's very true. Our theology of worship shows up when we go online. And I think it's interesting for me to see how different churches have got their online presence. And it's a great time to evaluate where we are with our worship theology, because if you are having a sort of a presentational model of worship, and you can just very easily go to an online presence, and the person who's watching that service doesn't feel any different at home than they would in the gathering, they don't feel connected to it, then I think we might need to evaluate that. It's harder to do. It's much harder to make people feel connected when you're online. But as far as your question, theology, that's a huge question. What is our theology of worship? And I think that we do need to evaluate that as churches. We often are just hit the ground running with everything that we plan, and we don't necessarily stop and say, what is our theology of worship? What's the theology presented in this song? And I think a great question to ask, just on a specific question about music, is what kind of a disciple is this song creating? If we're repeating, if we're singing the song and repeating it, month after month, what is being created in the heart of that person as we sing this song over and over again?
Wow, you bring up something there when you talk about looking at the theology then of the music that we're singing, the theology of what we're asking people to because when you with music it enters your heart and spirit. And
Right.
so what are we putting in that heart and spirit? Josh, what about you? Thinking of some of the best practices for a service that fosters discipleship?
Yeah, I love how Mary Beth said it, which was just a question. She phrased it in a question because I think sometimes in this everybody's an expert kind of world, it can seem like here's the silver bullet that you need to do, and your worship is going to be, perfect, and everyone's going to engage. So I don't want to do that at all. But I would ask another question, I guess, that I think about during this, which is like, is the gospel present, in what we're singing? And for me, that's one of the major questions that I'm asking myself and the other team of planners as we plan services is like, is the gospel really evident to people, whether it's in person or online? Will it be clear that Jesus had to die to make this service true, and he had to resurrect for this service to be what we're saying it is? So that it's really Christ-centered and about his death, resurrection, and gives the hope that he's coming again. Will it fill people with the hope of the good news?
I was in a service once where they had just sang a song, and the minister who was preaching got up right behind the song and said, "That's bad theology." So I would never want to do it in that way. I thought that was a bit much. But he was just so irritated, by what the words. But and you may not have one that you want to name, but do you ever have any songs that you said, maybe we want to rethink this? Do you ever, now don't
Yeah.
answer if you
Yeah.
if you
Yeah,
can't.
I mean, I do, and I'm notorious for that on our staff. My staff is they keep me in check because I'm always like, why would they say those words, or why do we frame it that way? And I think honestly, like, the Lord and others are helping me with even the balance of that, because there's been points where I'm like, man, I need to be more intentional about what we're singing and what our people are, what is on their lips and in their hearts to each other and to the Lord. And the Lord's convicted me there. And then there have been points where I'm like, man, I feel like a Pharisee, where I'm just so worried about, one little word when the heart of the people is moving in the right direction. So I just think it's like, yeah, it requires that balance. And that's why if you have a worship planning team, that's really important. We have a guy on our planning team his name's Scott, and he's just the best. He's just great heart, really not like technical, or he's always the one to say like, but where's the heart? Where's the feeling behind this? And I'm always the one to think of, theologically correct wording and all of that. So I just think it requires both of those, that balance to be there, so that we're not just nitpicking, but we're also very intentional about what we're doing.
So I hear you saying mentioning a worship planning team. What type of people would you put on that team?
Yeah. I think it might have been Kevin Myers he was talking about teams and people he keeps around him. Either him or John Maxwell, one of the two. They were saying they always keep one person who is like maybe a new Christian, or somebody who is younger in the faith or something like that. I think that's a great idea. Also, anybody who's interested in worship. So for us, we have all of our worship leaders are on that team. And we've asked different lay people to join at different times, who are like for Christmas season or Easter, maybe help us planning that, and just help us think through what does it look like from their eyes. So yeah, just a good team is diverse, a good team is interested in the topic, and even a team can be a great place to teach people about worship.
When you think of this whole worship planning process, are there any pitfalls that come to mind that you would say, if you were walking along this worship planning pathway, and Maribeth, I'll invite you in to weigh in on that too, walking along this worship planning pathway, because again, so many times we not all churches are even thinking about that. It's just something we do.
Yeah.
Let's grab a hymn, let's grab a this, let's grab a that.
Yeah.
Are there any pitfalls? And are there any things that specifically would say this is not helpful as in terms of worship for discipleship?
Yeah. Yeah, I think of, I guess just the positive would be intentionality is what we have to have, because if not, the pitfall is we just gravitate towards what we like. And I mean, I've been there so many times where it's like we just end up singing stuff that I like, or scriptures, keep going back to scriptures that I like. And we did as a church 1 year where we were just really intentionally on the lectionary. So it's like different scriptures that you're given every week to utilize. And that was even helpful for me to realize the things that I would miss, or the holes maybe in theme, places I wouldn't normally go in music or prayer or scripture, that it kind of forces you to go to. So I would say the need is intentionality.
I hear what you're saying, and I hear you saying also that so in that intentionality, I hear diversity. I hear diversity of script. You know, we all have our favorite passages.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
sometimes we we just stay in the New Testament all the time,
Yep.
or sometimes the Old Testament. But I hear you saying some intentionality, and that there are practical tools that can help us, like the lectionary. That might be
Yep.
one that help us just kind of think across a spectrum,
Yeah.
so that throughout the year we're covering different, in terms of discipleship, we
Yeah.
are actually covering various themes and various topics. We're inviting you, if you're in the chat room and you have a question, a comment, you want to just kind of press and push a little bit on Josh and Maribeth, do that, please. Come on in. Maribeth, what about for you when you think in terms of any pitfalls or best practices you want to mention?
Oh, I just resonate with what Josh is saying, because it is difficult to keep a balance in our worship if we aren't using that team. We have a worship team as well, and that helps to keep the balance, because especially if you bring someone on the team who is a good theologian, a good Bible student, and they keep everyone's feet to the fire on how we're doing this, and we're not just repeating the same favorite things over and over again. So that's really key. I pretty much just agree with what he just said. I would think that also just thinking pastorally as we lead worship. The worship leader is a pastoral figure, and I think sometimes I've lived through the change from a traditional setting. I'm way older than Josh, so I've lived through what our Wesleyan churches have gone through, and many evangelical churches have gone through a more traditional setup and liturgy and everything, and then gone into the more modern style worship. Many of us have, and so I straddle both worlds, and I really love what we've done in both ways. I think that we have room for all of that, but we do need to think a little bit more carefully about how we're doing it when we throw out things that are important. But then when you bring things back in, say, I think there's a lot of people that are they're definitely more interest in some more traditional things, like adding creeds and written prayers and liturgy that's been part of the church for hundreds of years or even millennia. And there's interest in that. And but it's easy to kind of get really excited about that and start adding all of these things. You have to carry people carefully into those places with new stuff that might be new to them. It's old, but it might be new to them.
Maribeth, I would just jump in on that. I was at the Calvin Institute of Worship this past year, and I was super just encouraged and challenged by Nikki Lerner. I don't know if you know who she is, but she's a great multicultural worship leader, and she intentionally brings all these different styles together. So as you think of like adding these rich things, one thing she did that I thought was so cool that really challenged me was like she did this old school traditional confession, but it was so pastoral right before. She just said like, you know, sometimes we have these burdens and we try to lay them down, but then we want to pick them up again, and the Lord never picks them back up. You know, she's just being so real. And then she goes into a confession. So I think one of the things that has been challenging for me and helpful for me lately, even thinking about traditional and modern, is like when those two worlds can come together and like a creed can feel really real, or it can feel, or a confession or something like this, it doesn't feel disconnected from real life, but is brought with really energy and life and our real personality infusing it.
Josh, thank you for saying that. Thank you also for mentioning Calvin Institute. There's a lot of good worship resources there, worship.calvin.edu, a lot of resources. But the beauty of it is the breadth of the diversity. If you've ever been to that institute, I've also gone, you'll hear everything from chants to gospel to classical to hymns. There's just this breadth. I want to transition a little bit, and I want to bring in Jen and Brandon Peterson. And we're just so glad you're here to talk to us as we have this conversation and we talk about pivoting and worship. You are doing all of this right in the epicenter of where the COVID-19 virus, New York City, New York.
Yeah.
And so you are what we would call on the front lines. They talk, it's funny because they talk about frontline health workers and frontline grocery people, but you are frontline pastors. Mm-hmm. And so first of all, Jen, why don't you tell us just what it's like? What's it like being in New York right now?
Yeah, I was on a call with someone yesterday and basically they said, what has changed? And it's amazing that in a few weeks' time, everything has changed, everything from, how we do our shopping to school, to church, to our hospitals. I think it really became real for us a few weeks ago when we were over by Central Park and the emergency field hospitals were going up by Samaritan's Purse. And that's where we have our church picnics. And it was just like this moment of going, wow, things are not what they used to be. And refrigerator trucks outside hospitals all over the city. If you look outside at a hospital and all of the patients that have COVID are in rooms that have a window has been knocked out and replaced with a board that has a hole in it because it has to be a zero pressure room because of the ventilators, and it is window after window after window. So it's just really sobering. It's really a little bit surreal right now. And we talk about worship, and what we have, I think, found right away was we had to look at worship and discipleship and mission and go, how are we going to function in all of these right now? And the beautiful thing is, if you think of them as concentric circles, in the middle there, that is following Jesus, right there. So that we had to pivot really quick. I don't know if you guys read Ed Stetzer's article that kind of talked about the 4 phases of dealing with this crisis, but for us, pivoting to online worship was happening simultaneously with Respond and Engage, with our community and what was going on. So I think what we found right away was that suddenly it absolutely was not about a Sunday experience, not that it ever is, but it's immediately caring for people every day of the week and going, what does this look like in your life right now? And so to see people dive into prayer, to see people dive into lamenting and just worshiping, talking about songs, giving us our words right now, we just find ourselves in that all the time. And we can dissect it all day long. But the reality is, when you find yourself in crisis, what is your heart crying out? Those are the words you're going to sing,
Brandon, why don't you follow up for this, in terms of the worship implications? For example, even Easter Sunday, probably 2,000 people dying on your proclaim that day. I don't have the exact numbers, and you're in the church, you're proclaiming online the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. What implications has it been to be on the front lines and doing worship at this time? Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to even looking at how we use our time during the week before COVID-19, I would say, we probably did more planning. We were probably doing more sitting at a desk and, those kinds of things. I think once when COVID-19 happened, it was immediately, where are people at? What are they dealing with right now? And for our church, we're a 3-year-old church. We planted the church 3 years ago. In fact, the first Sunday of April was our 3-year anniversary, which was quite surreal to celebrate that with nobody in the same room with each other. But literally, it went from our very first Sunday that we were online, we just did a Facebook Live and an Instagram Live, something really basic because it was a very last minute shift for us. But immediately that next week, it went to nobody could meet together. So it went from, oh, we've got to be online this week, to all of a sudden everybody's isolated, very, very, very quickly. So I would say one of the things that shifted for us was we've just spent much, much, much more time trying to figure out where people are at, how they're doing, and what's happening. So one of the things, and I think this informs our worship, is we've just implemented a weekly survey of the entire congregation to say, how are you doing physically? How are you doing, emotionally? How are you doing spiritually? Are you feeling isolated? Do you have people you can go to, and all of that, just so that when we get up in front of an iPhone or a camera to preach a sermon, or, we're, leading, sung worship or whatever that looks like. So we're actually speaking to the realities of what our people are dealing with at the moment. And I think that's the most important thing, is how are people doing, and what is the message on an Easter that will actually speak to where they're at this point. So I think that for me, it's been much less actually planning time and more like worship, or more just getting a pulse of where people are at right now.
Mm-hmm. So I hear you listening, practicing the art. That's a good emotionally healthy skill too, from our emotionally healthy discipleship. But listening at this time also. How would you say? What has been the impact on the congregation? Because some churches are in states where it's not quite as drastic. They're not seeing as many deaths. It just doesn't have quite the same feel or intensity as you do there in New York. What does it feel like as pastors being there at this time? What are you hearing from your congregation? What are you sensing? What things are bubbling up?
Yeah, the first week that we got our congregational survey back, the number one need was emotional support and connection and community. And so we called a counselor friend of ours and just said, would you be willing to do a webinar with, our congregation on how do we grieve right now? What does that look like? And how do I manage this? And so we did that last week. It depends on your church and your context, really, because obviously New York is very, very diverse, and in a lot of ways we talk about it as a tale of two cities, or a tale of two churches, right? Because you have churches that like our church is very young, and a lot of people have means to leave the city. So probably maybe almost half of our church has scattered, literally gone back home, wherever home might be. So they're not here right now. And some people are really dealing with, I feel like I've abandoned my city. And so they're really struggling with that. And then you have other churches who, we have a friend who pastors a church in the Bronx that as of last week, he lost 11 congregation members in 1 week. And I think we all saw the news that the Church of God in Christ denomination has lost 30 bishops. Our churches, in particular, people of color, are hit so hard right now. Yeah. And so there's just a lot of loss and a lot of grief. And so we're trying to figure out, for those churches who have the means to give and to step in and support right now, how do we do that? And for those churches who are really hurting and needing support right now, how do we do that? And so there's this beautiful coming together of the church in order to serve one another and to serve our larger community.
Jen, you mentioned people of color who are kind of experiencing this disproportionately. And actually, that's our next discipleship conversation. We're going to be talking about COVID-19 and Wesleyan communities of color. So we're going to be talking about this in our next webinar. Brandon, I know that you as you're leading worship, how are you planning? You heard Maribeth and Josh talk about some of the things that are in their hearts as they're planning. How are you planning a service that's going to be online to this community at this time, facing these things? What's your process?
Well, in a lot of ways, we just took our normal Sunday process and just made that online in many ways. But I think actually what we were doing normally worked really well for people in terms of how they respond to that. For instance, we observe communion nearly every week at our church here in the city normally. And so we decided, well, let's just continue that. And that's a little bit on how do you do that through a screen and all of that. But we've just decided that part of the physical, tangible experience of Christ particularly in a hard time, is going to be very comforting and definitely be a means of grace for people in a time like this. And so we decided, let's keep it. Let's keep that and make this as meaningful as possible for people in that sense. The other thing is just, I think, to speak directly to the need. I've heard, sometimes you hear a sermon of hope, and that sermon of hope comes out of this place of, hey, we all just sort of have to, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and just be hopeful. And it doesn't actually come out of the experience of our own pain. And so I think because I think we've spent much more time interacting with people in this time, I think there's a sense where we can speak out of our collective pain together, hope, which doesn't feel canned and hopefully doesn't feel, cheesy or whatever. But it's like, we are hurting right now. In fact, Jesus went to the cross and he suffered and he hurt. He grieved so much in the Garden of Gethsemane that he, wept tears of blood. Mm-hmm. I mean, he completely identifies with where you are at right now. That's why we can have hope. And so in a lot of ways, and the other thing I would say, just in terms of like technically how we're doing worship online, we've just decided to make it very simple at this point. We can't actually get together to record like a worship team together or anything like that. And so we've just decided to keep it simple. So our worship leader, whoever it is for that week, typically just records themselves leading a set at their place and sends it to us. And then we record. I mean, maybe we'll pass like a prayers of the people or something like that. We'll pass that to some other people, have them send in the videos, throw it all together, make sure the audio is clear enough for everyone, and then just run with that. And I think that's actually worked really well, and it feels fairly authentic for us.
And we've been using the Church Online platform, which has worked really great for us. But also following each service, we do a Zoom call where we basically call it a Zoom coffee hour. And so we just invite anybody in to say, hey, if you just want to come hang, if you just want to see some other faces right now, grab a cup of coffee and let's chat for 30, 45 minutes together. And that's been a really good time of just coming together. Does anybody have any needs that anyone else can meet? And it's been wonderful. So, yeah.
Hey, I want to just ask the folks who are listening and watching, why don't you jump on in? I'd love to hear from you some of the things that you've had to pivot. I'd love to hear if you have any Zoom tips, Zoom worship planning tips. If you have any questions for anyone who's on our panel today, just please come on in. We'd love to have you be a part of this. Don't hold back and ask. I'm going to hop back for a minute now to Josh Lavender, as you are sending those questions, comments. Tell us what you're doing, how you're transitioning during this time, what questions you have. And while you're doing that, Josh, I want to jump back because we were talking about resources. And there is a brand new resource that is coming out of the Wesleyan Church. And I think this time, it could be really useful. That's the Wesleyan Worship Collective. Why don't you start by telling us, Josh, what is the Wesleyan Worship Collective? What's behind it? How did it get started?
Yeah, so the Wesleyan Worship Project is like a group of Wesleyan worship leaders and songwriters who basically we've come together now 4 times, usually in the spring and the fall, for songwriting retreats. And what we're trying to do is just basically write to the needs. One of the things that we've talked about is how the Wesleyan Methodist movement is just rich in hymnody and really discipling worship music. And so our desire has been to just redig the wells of Wesleyan Methodist songwriting. And so what we've done is we've asked speakers who are worship scholars or pastors to come in and help us highlight different prayers or songs that are lost or missing in our worship right now. And I do think this time is really perfect for something like this, because there's different voids or needs that we see in the worship of the church and different churches. And what we're trying to do is just write to those voids. We give our people a well-rounded, just full experience and expression of worship.
So you are writing new songs, writing new music then. Okay.
Yep, that's right.
And this music is going to be available to Wesleyan churches. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So we'll actually be releasing a full CD in the fall coming up here, but we've already released one single so far. And the people on this album are different Wesleyan songwriters and worship leaders. And there's worship leaders leading on the album from churches all over the United States. And yeah, it's just been a great time for us to share resources. And when we get together, we eat food together. We spend 3 days together writing, and we show each other what we've written in the evenings. And it's just a great time of connection and learning and creativity.
Well, I think we actually have one of the songs that's coming out of our own Wesleyan Worship Collective. I want us to listen to that, just prepare our hearts. Let's just use this moment to just take a deep breath and hear this song that's written by our own Wesleyan tribe. Also, while that song is playing, if you have a question about worship and discipleship during this time, go ahead and come into the chat room and bring that. And then on the other side, after we've heard this song, I want you to tell us a little bit about how it came about and how we connect. So let's just prepare our hearts. We're going to listen to something from our own Wesleyan Worship Collective.
Mighty God, you wake creation up to sing your praise. There is life in every word you say. Come and speak to us. Perfect one, the light you give is brighter than the sun, and darkness cannot overcome your love. Come and shine on us. You alone are holy. The earth is full of your glory. Powerful one, for all you've done, we give you praise. You alone are worthy. Cleanse our hearts with your glory. God, let your name flow from this place to all the earth. Lord of life, you're giving breath to every living thing. We're joining in the song creation sings. Come and move in us. Glorious, you sit upon the throne that has no end. Welcome us into your arms again. We praise the great I am. You alone are holy. The earth is full of your glory. Powerful one, for all you've done, we give you praise. You alone are worthy.
Hey, Josh, that was beautiful. Some folks we got some questions coming in, so great. Tell us first of all, Josh, where folks can get. We just kind of heard the Zoom version of the song, and if somebody wanted the fuller experience, tell us where we could go and how they could get that. And then we have a question for you. They want to know, will any of the songs be recorded in Spanish? So that's coming in from our chat room.
Yeah. So the song's available kind of everywhere music is available. Spotify, iTunes. You can go on YouTube and listen to it, but it's pretty much available everywhere under Wesleyan Worship Project. And the song is called Full of Your Glory. The whole CD will be released later this year, but this is just the first single. And yes, we actually have so far just one of the songs will be in Spanish, but many more to come, I'm sure. One cool thing is whoever's asking may know David Lamas. He's from Ohio at Columbus, Ohio, a church there. And he's going to be leading that song, great worship leader. And then this single, Heather Haithcock and Chelsea Wood from Alive Wesleyan are on it. Jordan and Daniel Reif were some of the writers on it. So just cool to see different people from the Wesleyan tribe coming together.
Well, Josh, you've got coming in from the chat room, you've got an affirmation from a little person. Someone wrote to say, my baby likes the song. They're clapping. And
yes, that's what we want.
That's a thumb up. That's a thumb up.
That's what we want.
I'm going to open this up. We've got some other questions coming in for dialogue. I'm opening it up to the whole panel. And someone would like to know how during this time, do we have any ideas for engaging volunteers? Any ideas for how we engage our volunteers at this time? And
one of the things I could say, I guess, that our church started doing is we created somebody who was very administratively gifted, created an Excel spreadsheet of all of our people and all of our volunteers. And on the spreadsheet, we just divided up people in groups of 50. And so each staff member took 50 people every week that we just call. And we'll send like little videos to and say, how are you doing? Just remember, we love you. And is there anything that you need? And so that has been, I think, huge for us and huge for me in taking care of the worship team. Is I just picked people from the worship team mostly who I'm calling and reaching out to and just trying to stay connected with.
You know, that's just a really great idea. I was on a conference Zoom I think it was just yesterday, and they were talking about engaging volunteers. They had set up a whole system. We don't have time to talk about it today. We'll talk about another conversation, but they set up a system in the same way that you'd have volunteers in the church. These were online volunteers that welcomed people from your online service into online rooms where the volunteers greeted them. And so that's a great question, because we have to rethink, how are we going to engage people? And we also have to think about how are we going to, even in the worship service, how are we going to, no one just wants to sit and just listen. So how are we going to engage? There's some wonderful things that are starting to bubble up in terms of having sermon discussion groups in Zoom rooms after the sermon. So lots of good things are happening as we're all trying to figure this out. But that is one of the questions of how will we engage volunteers. And I was really intrigued by this whole concept of having, just as you'd have a greeter, having an online greeter and having that presence online. We've had coming in from our chat. Yes, Jen.
I was going to say, Kim, that's a great idea. Like, keep those ideas coming, because those were excellent. That's one thing we've just had fun. Like, a few people from our congregation have served as hosts for our online worship services. And same thing, where they're just really intentional about greeting people and interacting during the service and during the sermon. And the online platform has that little heart button that can go crazy. So all those ideas are great. We've also, just had people record themselves leading our prayers of the people time, where we just get to see another face. And, I think a lot of us on Easter, did the whole people recording songs from different places, and then Brandon is tech savvy enough, so he mixed that all together just to continue seeing each other, because I think they get tired of seeing our two faces, week after week. So that's a great question, Kim. How do we continue to keep people connected in volunteer roles?
We just had someone in the chat room who's shared another way. This is coming all the way from the Philippines. One of our and the Asia Pacific Nazarene Theological Seminary in Manila, and the chaplain there is sharing that one of their first online service was on Good Friday, and she felt it was very important that they actually have people connect. So people were quarantined in their rooms, so they couldn't have physical contact, but they delivered to each dorm room the elements, and they got to see their group leader drop the elements off. So, but I think we're going to have to think through these kinds of things. Keep sending those questions. Got just another couple minutes or so, but we're going to have to ask, how do we engage people? How do we create community online? And so, I have a smaller congregation, and so I can take some liberties that you might not want to do if you have 1,000 people online. But sometimes we turn off. We have a gathering before, just as you gather before church, we just leave the Zoom room kind of open, and people are greeting and virtually hugging, etc. And sometimes during the service, we turn off the mute and let everybody just say amen and give praise, just so there's some interaction. We've got some more questions coming in. Let me throw those out to you, panel. One says, what would worship as a lifestyle look like that would reflect and lead to discipleship? What would worship as a lifestyle look like that would reflect and lead to discipleship?
One thought on that, and I've been thinking about this, and I think that the church in the West and in North America has been so built around the Sunday gathering. And again, I wouldn't throw away the Sunday gathering for anything, but it's been so built around the Sunday gathering that I think one of the things this does is it exposes, I think, how discipleship has failed to move in many ways beyond the Sunday gathering. And so, worship as a lifestyle for me means, how do we recapture the home as a discipleship environment, whether you have a family or you're single, or you have roommates or whatever that looks like. And, going from like the temple, so to speak, being, I come 1 hour on Sundays to the temple, and that's my worship, to what does it look like to be discipled in our homes? I think there's a huge opportunity for that. I'm not sure we've figured it out yet, but I think that's one thing that, well, if we can figure that out in this season, that could be very powerful in terms of how the church moves forward on mission.
While you're speaking, Petersons, and the questions come in from the chat room for you, and folks wanted to know, what format did you use? You talked earlier about doing a survey with your congregation. That was new for some of us. They want to know, how'd you do it? What format did you use? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, we're using a pre-done survey that was out of, I don't know, it was like Carrie Newhoff and Dave Kinnaman, I think, put it together. Can't remember the name of it offhand without looking for it, but you could also just do like a Google form, something like that you can just share, get the link for the form and send it in an email and just say, would you help us understand how you're doing? We want to know how you're doing right now. And so I think sometimes as leaders, we get so caught up in, let me tell you what we're doing as a church, and we don't actually say, how are you doing? And I think we have to close those gaps, especially when we can't be together in person, to help people understand that we are there, that we're there for them, that we're here to serve, them as well. So, but I wish I could remember the exact name of that check-in, but it's a weekly check-in survey that someone else had developed.
That's just a great listening tool. We had another idea that has come in. There's a congregation that has interviewed people in the congregation on Zoom. They recorded the interview and then just showed it as an encouragement, and showed it during their online service. So I think you had mentioned bringing in other voices. And so this is just another idea of interviewing people in the congregation, pre-recording it so that they hear and see a variety of folks. And they get to also have some encouragement or commiseration or whatever that might be. We actually are running out of time for today's conversation, but I just want us to think once more about this whole concept of the in fostering discipleship through our worship services. And this is not something that's just a one-time thing or one, but I just want to encourage us as we are redesigning, as we are having to retool, as we are having to re-platform, this is the perfect time to say, might we pay attention to our theology? Might we be more diverse in what we're offering? Might we listen, make sure that we're listening to our congregation? So it's just a wonderful time to think about the discipleship implications, and then even how we will actually do discipleship. That's the new conversation. How are we going to do discipleship in these times? So we just wanted to just kind of stir that pot this morning. But as we close, I'd just like for each one on our panel to, and I'll call you, to tell us in rapid fire. We ask, how would you define a disciple, and what's your best discipleship tip? And that could be a general discipleship tip, or it could be a tip just for these times. So definition of a disciple, and then your discipleship tip. Maribeth, why don't we start with you?
Kim, I define a disciple as someone who's living by the greatest commandment. Jesus says it is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So they're living by the greatest commandment, and they're using, the word disciple and discipline are closely related. They use the spiritual disciplines to increase their love for God. And I like to borrow from James K.A. Smith. He said that a disciple is a curator of our hearts. So like an art curator, we're picking and choosing things to add into our hearts using the spiritual disciplines.
It's great. Josh, how about you?
I think I just love Peterson's way of putting it, long obedience in the same direction. And I think just the best tip I would say I have is don't stop, just keep going.
Yeah.
Peterson's individually. This is not a couple exercise. I'll make you both do it.
Josh, I agree with that. In fact, I was thinking about that this morning, and how the long obedience in the same direction means it is daily. Like, I can't rely on something that happened 10 years ago, right? It is that daily obedience. But I also love just the Jewish blessing of, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. I want to be walking that closely with Jesus, that I'm covered in his dust, because there is no substitute for the presence of Christ, right? Just putting myself in his presence day after day after day and being formed and transformed.
Yeah. All really good. I probably borrow from Dallas Willard when he talks about, following Jesus and how we learn how to be with him, and we learn how to become like him, and then we do what he did. And I think so often we look at our lives and we're like, I think I'm becoming and I'm doing, but I'm not very good at being with. And so I think we have opportunity in this season to learn how to just be with Jesus, because we're at home, and we have to learn how to be with our families too, but we learn how to be with Jesus, and then we can become like him, and then do what he did. So.
Yeah, I get to answer this question all the time, so I'll just add another one. And that is my tip is this time, that for those of us who are in the quarantine kind of mode, to this time of being around family. I have my nephew living here with me, and this is a precious moment in terms of life on life discipleship. You have folks right in your household who are there, and if there's a way to utilize this time, I'm doing reviewing with him, or not reviewing because he hasn't done it, but I'm going over with him the emotionally healthy discipleship relational tools. And so this is, I'm just saying it's an opportunity, because I have a millennial captive in my house. And we do discipleship. So and he's enjoying it, I think. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for sharing today. We are going to continue to have these conversations. We actually are adding a conversation next week. I just want to let you know about that. on the hearts and minds of all of us, we're thinking about what happens when the church comes back to the physical building. What next? And so we want to have a conversation about that. We're going to invite, we have some really stellar guests who are coming from inside and outside the Wesleyan Church. And we want to begin to process, will it be business as usual? How are we thinking? What precautions? How do we wipe down in between services? What? So I invite you, that's going to be next week. You'll hear about it. But if you have questions about what next, why don't you go ahead and send those to us, and questions about the whole topic of reentry, go ahead and send those in, because we need to kind of just wrestle with that a little bit as churches, as we think about, we're in one season now, but what happened, there's another season that's coming upon us for some states sooner than other, and we really need to think through, talk through, encourage one another through what that might look like and what might God be doing. Mm-hmm. And so we just say that. One other thing I just wanted to let you know about, for those of you who are familiar with an organization called Fresh Expressions, they're actually doing a reentry conference on tomorrow. So if you want to attend that, just let me know. It's tomorrow at 1:00. They're going to be talking on a larger scale, but we're going to be talking specifically Wesleyan scale next week. So let's keep discipling together. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Maribeth. Thank you, Josh Lavender. Thank you, Brandon and Jen Peterson. Just so appreciate you and everyone who was on this Zoom call. Let's continue to worship, and let's continue to make disciples even during a pandemic. God bless.